January 1945. Western Europe lies under a dull, frozen sky. Snow clings to shattered hedgerows and cratered roads. The ground is hard, scarred by months of artillery fire and endless movement. Somewhere beyond a tree line, German infantry watch through field glasses. What they see does not match their expectations. Across the open ground, American soldiers move with practiced routine. Their positions are orderly. Tents stand firm against the cold. Smoke rises not from burning villages, but from field kitchens. Hot food is being served: coffee, meat, bread. Nearby, trucks idle, engines warm, ready to move at a moment's notice. The Germans shake their heads. Some laugh quietly. This, they think, is an army spoiled by comfort. For years they have endured hunger, cold, and exhaustion as proof of discipline. They have marched without rest, fought without relief, and slept in ruins, because suffering, they believed, forged superior soldiers. Compared to that, the American way looks indulgent, almost careless. But war does not judge by appearances. Within weeks, those same German units will find themselves pushed back, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed by forces that seem inexhaustible. The laughter will fade, doubt will set in, and an uncomfortable question will emerge, one that strikes at the heart of modern warfare. The answer begins long before this winter, in how two armies prepared their men for the reality that was coming next. By the time winter settled over Western Europe in late 1944, the war had already exposed two fundamentally different visions of how armies should fight and how soldiers should live. For the German military, the war had begun with speed, shock, and confidence. Blitzkrieg had shattered Poland in 1939, overrun France in 1940, and driven deep into the Soviet Union by 1941. These early victories reinforced a long-held belief inside the Wehrmacht. Hardship was not a flaw of war, but its defining test. Soldiers were expected to endure hunger, cold, and exhaustion without complaint. Comfort was viewed as softness. Endurance was strength. German training reflected this philosophy. Recruits were pushed hard. Long marches, minimal rations, strict discipline. A soldier who could function under misery was, in German doctrine, a soldier prepared for battle. This mindset had roots stretching back to Prussian military culture, where obedience, austerity, and sacrifice were inseparable from effectiveness. Across the Atlantic, a different army was forming. The United States Army entered the war later, but with a radically different approach. American planners believed wars were not won by suffering alone. They were won by sustained performance. That meant feeding soldiers well, resting them, rotating them out of the line, treating wounds quickly, and ensuring that a soldier in combat could focus entirely on fighting, not survival. This philosophy was not born from softness, but from industrial logic. The United States understood war as a massive system. Men, machines, fuel, food, ammunition, each part had to move smoothly. If one failed, the entire system slowed. Comfort, in this view, was not luxury, it was maintenance. When American forces landed in Normandy landings in June 1944, these differences were already visible. U.S. troops arrived with enormous logistical backing: prefabricated supplies, mobile hospitals, replacement depots, even ice cream barges followed the advance. To German observers, it looked absurd. German frontline troops, hardened by years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, could not reconcile what they saw. They had survived Stalingrad, Kursk, and the endless retreats under Soviet pressure. They had watched comrades starve, freeze, and collapse from exhaustion. Compared to that, American soldiers appeared inexperienced, too clean, too well-fed, too relaxed. This perception hardened into mockery. German intelligence reports often described American soldiers as dependent on supply lines, lacking initiative, and unable to withstand prolonged hardship. Propaganda reinforced this image, portraying the American army as a wealthy but fragile force, strong in numbers, weak in spirit. But while German commanders focused on toughness, their material reality was changing fast. By late 1944, Germany's industrial base was under relentless attack. Allied bombing campaigns devastated rail yards, factories, and fuel reserves. Trained replacements became scarce. Units at the front were under strength, undersupplied, and increasingly isolated. What had once been an ideology of endurance was now becoming enforced deprivation. American forces, meanwhile, continued to expand. Men flowed into Europe in steady waves. Equipment losses were replaced quickly. Damaged vehicles were repaired or swapped out entirely. Soldiers were rotated out of combat when possible, sometimes only for days, sometimes for weeks, but enough to prevent complete breakdown. The contrast was not just material, it was psychological. German soldiers were taught to endure until they broke the enemy or broke themselves. American soldiers were taught to endure long enough for the system behind them to win the war. As the front moved eastward through France and Belgium, these philosophies began to collide more violently. The question was no longer which army looked tougher, but which one could keep fighting when the war refused to end quickly. And as winter deepened, the consequences of these choices would become impossible to ignore. By the autumn of 1944, the Western Front had become a test not of speed, but of endurance. And endurance, increasingly, was being decided far behind the front lines. For the American Army, logistics was no longer a supporting function. It was the backbone of combat power. From the beaches of Normandy to the borders of Germany, the United States built a moving industrial network. One of its most visible arteries was the Red Ball Express, a non-stop convoy system that moved fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts forward day and night. Thousands of trucks drove under blackout conditions, often along damaged roads, delivering what frontline units needed before shortages could set in. This mattered more than German commanders initially realized. American soldiers in combat zones received regular hot meals when conditions allowed. Rations were calorie-dense and varied. Coffee was constant. Medical evacuation systems pulled wounded men off the line within hours, sometimes minutes. Field hospitals operated with surgical efficiency, returning many soldiers to duty, or at least preventing deaths that would have been inevitable in earlier wars. Even rest was systematized. Units were rotated out of the line when possible, not always comfortably, not always long enough, but enough to restore basic function. A soldier who slept, ate, and washed, even briefly, returned sharper, faster, and more resilient. German forces had no equivalent system left. Years of war had hollowed out the Wehrmacht's logistical depth. Fuel shortages crippled mobility. Rail networks were repeatedly destroyed by Allied air power. Replacement troops arrived with minimal training. Many frontline units survived on reduced rations, scavenging local food or relying on what little could be delivered under constant attack. Medical care deteriorated sharply. Field hospitals lacked supplies. Evacuation routes were dangerous or non-existent. Wounded soldiers often remained at the front until they could no longer move. The psychological toll of this reality was immense. What had once been framed as disciplined hardship now became chronic exhaustion. German soldiers went days without proper sleep. Winter clothing was scarce. Ammunition shortages forced units to conserve fire. Vehicles were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because there was no fuel to move them. Radios failed. Artillery support became unreliable. Yet the ideology of endurance persisted. German command culture discouraged withdrawal and frowned upon complaints. Units were ordered to hold positions regardless of condition. Pride prevented acknowledgement of systemic failure. The belief remained that toughness alone could compensate for material inferiority. On the American side, the system absorbed losses and continued moving. If a rifle broke, it was replaced. If a truck was destroyed, another arrived. If a unit took heavy casualties, replacements followed. This was not because American soldiers suffered less in combat, but because suffering was managed, not glorified. German observers noticed this difference, even if they misunderstood it. Captured German soldiers often remarked on American abundance, clean uniforms, cigarettes, medical kits. They spoke with disbelief about soldiers being pulled from the line for rest. To them, this seemed indulgent, almost immoral in war. What they did not yet see was the cumulative effect. An American unit that fought for weeks could still function. A German unit that fought for weeks often ceased to exist as an effective force, not because of defeat in battle, but because it had been ground down beyond recovery. By December 1944, as Germany launched its final major offensive in the West, this contrast would be pushed to its limits. The coming battles would not just test tactics and courage, but entire systems of war. And it was there, under the harshest conditions of the winter front, that the laughter about American comfort would finally meet the reality of sustained combat efficiency. For the individual soldier, war is measured not in strategy maps or production figures, but in hours without sleep, the weight of equipment, and the ability to keep moving when the body wants to stop. German infantrymen were conditioned to believe that pushing beyond physical limits was proof of worth. Hunger was tolerated, cold was endured, exhaustion was normalized. To complain was to fail. In the early years of the war, this mindset had produced remarkable resilience. Soldiers held positions under conditions that would have broken less disciplined forces. But by late 1944, the same philosophy began to consume its own strength. Men who had fought continuously for months showed signs of collapse. Reaction times slowed, judgment faltered, minor wounds became disabling. Yet the system offered no relief. There were few reserves, few rotations, few moments to reset. American soldiers faced the same dangers, shell fire, exposure, sudden death, but their experience unfolded differently. When possible, they were pulled back, given hot food, allowed to sleep, treated for injuries early. These were not luxuries, they were interventions. A rested soldier could aim better, move faster, think more clearly under fire. German soldiers noticed this difference firsthand. They watched American units reappear after being battered, fresh faces, clean equipment, steady cohesion. To men who had not left the line in months, this seemed unnatural. What they did not yet grasp was that endurance without recovery was not strength, it was attrition. The German army's culture had long equated suffering with legitimacy. The ability to endure deprivation was woven into military identity. From training camps to the front lines, hardship was framed as moral superiority. This belief was reinforced by propaganda. German soldiers were told they were harder, tougher, and more committed than their enemies. American abundance became evidence not of power, but of decadence. Chocolate, cigarettes, heated shelters, these were mocked as signs of weakness. In contrast, American military culture treated comfort pragmatically. There was little romanticism about suffering. The goal was not to prove toughness, but to win efficiently. If providing better food, clothing, and shelter improved performance, then it was justified. To German observers, this approach felt alien. Comfort had never been part of their doctrine. They mistook difference for deficiency. This cultural gap widened as the war dragged on. German soldiers clung to pride even as conditions deteriorated. American soldiers, supported by a vast system, continued operating with consistency. The irony was quiet but decisive. The army that preached endurance without relief was breaking down. The army that allowed comfort was still fighting at full capacity. Mockery served a purpose. It protected morale. Laughing at American comfort allowed German soldiers to rationalize their own suffering. It reinforced the belief that hardship gave them an edge, that they were morally stronger, even if materially weaker. But mockery could not stop exhaustion. It could not replace fuel, ammunition, or sleep. And it could not reverse the creeping realization that the enemy's softness was not slowing them down. As battles intensified, denial became harder to maintain. American units reacted faster, coordinated better, recovered more quickly after losses. The laughter grew quieter. Because beneath the jokes, a fear was forming, that the enemy's strength was not in how much they could endure, but in how long they could keep going. That realization would soon be tested under fire.
Tactics do not exist in isolation. They are shaped by what an army can maintain over time. German units were trained for decisive action, sharp attacks, rapid maneuver, and aggressive defense. But by late 1944, their ability to sustain operations was eroding. Shortages forced commanders to limit artillery fire. Fuel scarcity restricted movement. Exhausted troops reacted slowly to sudden changes. American units, by contrast, maintained tempo. Even after heavy engagements, they reorganized quickly. Communication stayed intact. Artillery support remained available. Infantry units could hold ground, withdraw, and counterattack with coordination. This was not because American soldiers were braver, but because they were supported. Tactical flexibility depends on reserves, of men, of energy, of equipment. The American system preserved those reserves. The German system consumed them. As a result, engagements that might once have favored German experience now tilted toward American persistence. The longer a battle lasted, the more the balance shifted. The technological angle: maintenance over heroics. German weapons were often admired for their design. Tanks like the Panther, machine guns like the MG-42, powerful, intimidating, effective. But advanced equipment demanded maintenance, fuel, and spare parts. By 1944, these requirements could not be met. Broken vehicles were abandoned, damaged weapons went unrepaired. Crews cannibalized parts from wrecks, hoping to keep a few machines operational. The technology remained impressive, but increasingly unusable. American equipment was designed differently, standardized, interchangeable, built for mass repair and replacement. A damaged tank could be swapped, a broken rifle replaced. The system did not rely on heroic maintenance under fire. Comfort played a role here too. A mechanic who slept and ate worked better. A crew that rested maintained equipment longer. Efficiency compounded quietly, day after day. The leadership angle: command under strain. German officers were trapped between doctrine and reality. Orders emphasized holding ground, regardless of condition. Withdrawal was discouraged. Flexibility was limited by ideology and fear of punishment. American commanders operated under different assumptions. Preserving unit effectiveness mattered. Pulling back to reorganize was acceptable. Logistics informed decisions, not just bravery. This difference shaped outcomes. German leaders often commanded units already at the breaking point. American leaders commanded units that could still respond. By early 1945, the gap was undeniable. Leadership could not overcome exhaustion, doctrine could not replace logistics, and as combat intensified, the consequences of these choices would converge violently on frozen roads, under artillery fire, in battles where endurance met collapse. That turning point still marked the turning point ahead.
December 1944 did not arrive quietly. The Ardennes forest was already deep in winter when German forces launched their final gamble in the west, the Battle of the Bulge. Snow muffled movement. Fog grounded aircraft. Roads froze into narrow corridors of ice and mud. For German commanders, these conditions offered one last advantage: surprise. For the soldiers, it offered no mercy. German units surged forward with determination born of desperation. Many believed this offensive could change everything, but behind the initial momentum lay a fragile truth. Fuel reserves were thin, ammunition was rationed, units were already exhausted before the first shot was fired. American forces were caught off guard, but not unprepared in the way German planners expected. Even as frontline units absorbed the shock, the American system reacted. Supplies were rerouted, reinforcements moved rapidly, medical services expanded under fire. Soldiers endured brutal conditions, but they did so within a framework designed to keep them functional. German troops advanced hard, then slowed. They encountered American units that should have collapsed, but did not. Defenders held positions longer than expected. When forced back, they regrouped. When surrounded, they resisted until relief arrived. The famous stand of the Bastogne was not just an act of courage, it was a demonstration of logistical resilience. American paratroopers endured encirclement because supply drops arrived. Wounded men were treated. Command remained intact. Even under siege, the system functioned. German attackers, meanwhile, began to stall. Fuel shortages stranded tanks. Infantry marched on foot through snow without proper winter gear. Wounded soldiers remained where they fell. Commanders pressed forward anyway, believing endurance would carry them through. It did not. As days passed, American units rotated where possible. Fresh troops entered the line. Artillery fire intensified as ammunition stocks stabilized. When skies cleared, Allied air power returned with devastating effect. German soldiers felt the shift immediately. The offensive lost momentum, not in a single moment, but in countless small failures. A unit unable to move, a weapon without ammunition, a soldier too exhausted to react quickly enough. What German troops witnessed now contradicted everything they believed. The Americans did not break under comfort. They recovered, they adapted, they returned stronger after every blow. By early January 1945, the offensive had failed. German units withdrew battered and depleted. Many soldiers later admitted that what shocked them most was not American firepower, but American endurance. An endurance sustained not by suffering, but by support. As the front stabilized and then began to move east again, the realization spread quietly through German ranks. The war was no longer being decided by who could endure the most pain, but by who could remain effective the longest. And the most decisive encounters were still ahead. By February 1945, the Western Front had changed its rhythm. The failed Ardennes offensive had drained what remained of German operational strength. Units that withdrew were shadows of their former selves, under strength, underfed, and worn down by weeks of continuous fighting. Many soldiers had not slept properly in days. Some had marched until their feet bled, only to be ordered back into defensive positions with little ammunition and no winter relief. Across the line, American forces were regrouping with deliberate calm. Supplies flowed forward again. Replacement troops arrived. Vehicles were repaired or replaced. Units that had been mauled in December returned to action, reorganized, reinforced, and ready. The system absorbed the shock and pushed forward. The next decisive test came at the Rhine. For the German High Command, the river was meant to be the final natural barrier, an obstacle that could delay the Allies long enough for negotiations or collapse elsewhere to change the outcome. Bridges were destroyed. Defenses were ordered to hold at all costs. But the men assigned to defend them were exhausted. When American forces approached the river in March, resistance was uneven. Some German units fought fiercely. Others surrendered quickly. Many could no longer coordinate effective defense. Radios failed. Command structures fractured. Morale had thinned to survival. American assaults unfolded methodically. Engineers worked under fire to construct bridges. Artillery suppressed defensive positions with sustained, accurate fire. Infantry crossed in waves, supported by armor and constant resupply. Medical teams followed close behind, pulling wounded men out almost as quickly as they fell. German soldiers watching these crossings saw something they could not counter. The Americans did not rush blindly. They did not pause from exhaustion. They moved with steady, relentless momentum, day after day, operation after operation. Losses were replaced, fatigue was managed, the advance did not stall. German officers began to acknowledge what frontline soldiers already knew. Captured reports and post-war testimonies reveal a growing recognition that American combat power did not come from individual toughness alone. It came from organization, from logistics, from a system that treated soldiers as assets to be preserved, not expended. One German officer later remarked that American troops seemed never-ending, not fearless, but constantly renewed. That perception mattered. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, resistance collapsed in waves. Entire units surrendered rather than fight battles they could not sustain. The myth of American softness had evaporated. What remained was an uncomfortable truth. Comfort had not weakened the enemy, it had multiplied him. By April 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The war in the West ended not with a dramatic final stand everywhere, but with silence, abandoned positions, and soldiers who could no longer continue. The German army had endured extraordinary hardship, but endurance without recovery had hollowed it out. And as the guns quieted, the consequences of that difference began to settle into history. The battlefield verdict was clear. What followed would reshape how wars were understood, planned, and fought. When the fighting in Western Europe finally ended in May 1945, the contrast between the two armies was visible everywhere, on the roads, in the camps, and in the men themselves. German soldiers emerged from the war gaunt, exhausted, and often stunned by how completely their strength had been spent. Many surrendered without resistance in the final weeks, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked the capacity to continue. Weapons were stacked neatly. Vehicles were abandoned where fuel had run out. Units that once prided themselves on discipline dissolved quietly into captivity. American forces, despite heavy casualties, remained organized. Supply depots expanded instead of shrinking. Field hospitals continued operating at full capacity. Soldiers rotated into occupation duties with uniforms intact and equipment functional. The system that had sustained them through months of combat did not collapse when the shooting stopped. It transitioned. Post-war interrogations of German prisoners revealed a consistent theme. Many expressed disbelief at American logistical depth. They spoke less about weapons and more about food, rest, and medical care. These elements, once ridiculed, were now acknowledged as decisive. German military reports, compiled after the surrender, reached similar conclusions. While bravery and training were not in question, the inability to sustain prolonged combat had proven fatal. Units broke not at the first contact, but after weeks of cumulative exhaustion. American analysts reviewing the campaign reached a different lesson. They concluded that morale was inseparable from material support, that a soldier's effectiveness declined rapidly without rest and care, and that industrial-scale logistics could translate directly into battlefield resilience. These insights would not remain theoretical. As Europe transitioned from war to uneasy peace, the armies that emerged carried these lessons forward. German officers entering captivity reflected on a doctrine that had demanded too much from the individual. American commanders began codifying what they had practiced, turning experience into formal military planning. The laughter that once greeted American comfort was absent now. In its place was a sober recognition. War had changed, not in courage or sacrifice, but in how endurance was achieved. And the consequences of that realization would extend far beyond the ruins of Europe. In the years that followed the war, the contrast observed on the Western Front became a central subject of military study. Former German officers, many of whom contributed to post-war analyses, were blunt in their assessments. The belief that hardship alone produced superior soldiers was no longer defensible. Endurance, they concluded, required replenishment. Without it, even the most disciplined force would eventually collapse. American military planners, meanwhile, treated the European campaign as validation rather than revelation. Logistics, morale, and medical care were no longer seen as secondary considerations. They were formalized as pillars of combat effectiveness. This thinking shaped the structure of post-war Western armies. Training doctrines emphasized rotation. Medical evacuation became faster and more integrated. Supply chains were designed not just to deliver ammunition, but to sustain human performance. Comfort was reframed not as indulgence, but as operational necessity. The implications extended into the emerging Cold War. As alliances formed and new conflicts loomed, the lessons of 1944 to 1945 influenced how forces prepared for prolonged confrontation. The idea that a modern army must preserve its soldiers to preserve its strength became central to planning across NATO. For Germany itself, the lesson was institutional. When the country later rebuilt its armed forces, the philosophy shifted. The new military rejected the cult of suffering that had defined its predecessor. Soldier welfare, rest, and support were integrated deliberately, acknowledging the cost of the old doctrine. History had delivered its verdict quietly but firmly. The German army had endured extraordinary hardship, but the American army had endured longer because it was designed to. What once seemed like weakness revealed itself as efficiency. What once looked like comfort revealed itself as strategy. And as historians, soldiers, and planners reflected on the war, a deeper understanding emerged, one that challenged centuries of martial tradition. That understanding would shape not just armies, but the very idea of what strength in war truly meant. The Second World War reshaped the meaning of military strength. For generations, armies had measured power in courage, discipline, and the willingness to endure suffering. These qualities did not disappear in 1939. They remained essential. German soldiers proved that endurance could carry men through unimaginable hardship. But the war revealed something new. Endurance alone was no longer enough. Industrial warfare demanded sustainability. It demanded systems that preserved human capability instead of consuming it. It demanded armies that could fight today, recover tomorrow, and return the next week with undiminished force. The American approach did not eliminate hardship. Its soldiers froze, bled, and died alongside their enemies. But it reduced unnecessary loss. It treated recovery as a form of combat power. It understood that a soldier kept alive, fed, rested, and treated was not weaker, but more dangerous. German soldiers had laughed at comfort because they misunderstood its purpose. They believed suffering created strength. The war proved that survival sustained it. By 1945, the laughter had vanished, replaced by a quiet recognition that modern warfare had changed. Victory belonged not to the army that demanded the most from its men in the shortest time, but to the one that asked enough and gave enough back to keep them fighting until the end. In that frozen field in Germany, as American units prepared to move forward once more, the lesson was already written into the landscape. Not in speeches or slogans, but in the simple fact that one army could still advance and the other could not. And that truth would shape military thinking for the rest of the century.